Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture, brought to you by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Table Podcast, where we discuss issues of God and culture. My name is Kymberli Cook, and I'm the Senior Administrator here at the Hendrick Center. And today we're going to be talking about reviving historic voices and why it is so important for the church to pay attention to her own history. We're joined by Troy and Elise Frasier. Troy is the children's pastor at Northside Christian Church. He wears a lot of hats right now. He's a student at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he's also the founder of Revived Studios, which is an effort to revive historic sermons and not allow them to be forgotten. And Elise serves alongside Troy and jumped into the studio with Revived Radio and is going to be a part of launching another show very soon. So thank you so much for both of you being here and for joining us.
It's good to be on.
We're happy to be here.
So could you just tell us a little bit more about yourselves, kind of ministry, how you ended up in seminary, how you ended up as a children's pastor, what your hopes are for ministry, as well as, how you got started with Revive Studios and kind of the heart and a little bit of the story behind that.
Sure. I was raised in Florida, went to Calvary Bible College around 2011. I met Elise there, and we got married in about 2014. I should know that better than that, but about 2014.
Approximately.
Exactly. And we've been married now for moving into our, heading towards 7 years. And we've had 2 kids since then. But when we graduated Bible college together, we didn't realize it, but God was going to take us to a bunch of different places. He took us to Orlando to work with at-risk youth from Miami. We ended up 2 years teaching in China with our daughter. That was a lot of fun, but a pretty crazy time too. And then I was working a couple of years ago at a school downtown in Miami as well as a teacher. So we were kind of jumping all over the place. And from there, I really had it on my heart to go to seminary, wanted to kind of further my education and kind of finish up that. I felt like that was something God was calling me to, and I have a desire for that kind of stuff. And so we ended up at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and that's where I'm working as a children's pastor. I've just always been teaching kids, so it just seemed like a really natural fit. But at the same time, while we were in China, we were thinking about how you're behind like a firewall, and there's only so much information. People who don't know, China kind of controls what comes and goes through the internet. Mm-hmm. And there was just this idea of I wonder what stuff we're not getting access to because we've kind of built up our own. Here's what we read and here's what we don't read. And something I started looking at was these old sermons. And as I was kind of reading through sermons by Dietrich, Bonhoeffer, and some of these other people, I realized wow, it'd be so cool if we could listen to these sermons again and actually hear them as if they were being preached. And when me and Joel, the other co-founder of Revive Studios, got together and started working on our podcast, Revive Thoughts, and we started fleshing it out. And it took a long time, about 1.5 years to get it actually from the planning stages to the first episodes. We realized this is something really special, and that these sermons, even though they're sometimes 100, 500, 1,000, I think our oldest sermon is 1,800 years old, it still applies today. The same truth that God was preaching then is still around today. So since we launched Revive Thoughts about 1.5 years ago, now we've launched Revive Devos, which does daily devotional bits from wisdom of the past. Elise jumped in with Revived Radio, and I can let you take care of why that show is, what's going on with that one.
Yeah, this one, basically, it's the original voices that sometimes you don't know that they actually exist. For example, we have Jim Elliott, C.S. Lewis, which I didn't even know that. Jim Elliott actually has a very booming voice, and you wouldn't imagine that he would have, I don't know, it's just kind of interesting to see, you've done a lot of his, or you've heard a lot of his writings and things like that. You hear a lot about him, but you never heard his voice. And so he doesn't sound like what you would imagine he would sound like. It's just he's very dynamic. He gets in there, he's got this deep voice, and he's very, very, very dynamic. And then you have C.S. Lewis, who just kind of brings you in the British kind of chill way, but he's just dropping truth bombs constantly. So it's kind of fun to hear all the different personalities shine through where you don't get it in necessarily the written format. Mm-hmm. So we take the audio, we enhance it. Sometimes it's really garbled. Sometimes you have things that have been tacked onto it that don't make any sense. So we kind of edit those out.
That's the thing with the Revived Thoughts too. We have to edit the sermons as well when we get them. So a lot of times they're coming in from the 1500s. The English has changed a lot since then. And sometimes the sermon was preached in the 1500s. The last person to touch it lived in the 1800s. So we're getting multiple layers of editing that have to be done. So we always modernize them so that they're easy to listen to, easy to speak for our speakers. Each episode has a different person come on. So and if you're listening, that's 3 different podcasts we mentioned. We have 3. We also have a 4th called Revived Thoughts Deep Dives, and we have multiple on the way. So we are trying as much as we can to bring as much church history to life and just bring it to people.
Some people really love history. Obviously, there's like massive amounts of popular fiction, and not even fiction, popular like nonfiction of history. And so there are people who really love it. Others, and perhaps a majority of people, hear history and they think about some kind of 8th grade textbook that they were forced to, read 7 pages of, and they're like completely tune out and are done because they think it's just dry and dusty and all that. So I guess what is, with y'all's effort of reviving these things, what do you say when people say, yeah, but like, why should I care? Why should I care about what they said? Why should we care about church history?
Yeah, I think there's several good answers to that. In our case, with the old sermons we're doing and stuff like that, we care about a lot of what these guys have to say as theologians. If I told you, oh, we just found a brand new book by Charles Spurgeon, it's getting published for the first time, most people are like, oh, I gotta read that. What did he say? What did some of these great theologians of the past say? But then when I look at them and I say, like, you have a whole volumes of sermons and we can turn them into audio at any time. People are like, oh, well, that's not, that's probably not as important. But the sermons are applied theology. This is how they're telling you how to live out their great thoughts to the church that they would preach in and out of all day. I mean, most of these theologians were preachers before they were theologians. Also, church history, especially church history, is applied theology. We can come up with ideas and we can talk and point at whiteboards and say, this is what justification means. And if you get this wrong, something bad will happen. But then you can look at history and go and see, here are the groups of people who got it wrong. And here's where it went wrong. Like, for example, John Gill in the 1700s was like, the Trinity is a very important doctrine. And if you don't get this right, you're going to lead yourself into deism and Unitarianism. And if you look at the 1700s, you can go exactly what happened. That is, he literally predicted because of that. And we can look back and see the different groups who got theology and pieces wrong and then where they ended up afterwards. So it's a really good laboratory for us to study. But also, and this is just from scripture and from Christians, Hebrews 12, it says, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. That cloud of witnesses continues. Like, the church is still around today. We still have the saints who have lived and had these inspiring lives and done these incredible, incredible things. And if you're someone who wants to be a preacher or in ministry, you should study the lives of some of the best people: Charles Spurgeon, Jonathan Edwards, John Calvin, Martin Luther, Hudson Taylor. These guys probably did it better than you'll ever do it. So you should make them your models. And at the same time, you can be so inspired by the things they live through. I've talked to a lot of people who said, I'm struggling with this or struggling with that right now. And, I'm not super worried about the future because I've seen just how incredible some of these people and what these people have gone through. And I go, I know that the church and we can be okay if we live out the same faith that the men and women that came before us did. And lastly, too, again, these stories are just very encouraging. It's a very good apologetic for your faith. If you're ever questioning, like, well, is what I believe true? Look at church history and look at the people who laid down their lives and look at the people who lived and fought against the issues of their day. And you'll feel much more confident, like, no, our faith is true. Look at all these people who've come before us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's one of our church history professors here at DTS has said, it was John Hanna, and he's very famous for like having all of these like one-liner kind of things. But he said in one of my classes, there are people in these old crusty books that I found that I could talk to, and I found my refuge with them. And so even, I think you're right. Like, especially for people in ministry and preachers, particularly in what you all are dealing with the sermons, there's definitely, these are people who are who are very much still people. I guess Chesterton calls it the democracy of the dead. So like that, you are a part of the church with them, and they have things to say that can help you and can help guide you, but also for just a regular person who sits in the pew, doesn't have necessarily any role on Sunday morning or anything like that. There are people in church history that have gone through the doubts and the trials and the suffering that you have, and that you can sit with them, and especially those whose writings have persisted. They usually have really good things to say to you, and it's lasted because it's so good, and that's what I love about what you guys are doing is you're highlighting some of those things that are just so salty and good, that shouldn't be lost. Elise, what are your thoughts? What do you find helpful and important about church history?
Well, I kind of think about it as an interest in, you're interested in your own family genealogy. People have, obviously, Ancestry.com is huge. People love to know where they come from. And in the same way, and even how their country was founded, et cetera, we have interest in other aspects of history, but we kind of forget church history, even though, as an identity, in your identity in Christ, and all these Christians that came before you, you have a genealogy of Christendom, I guess you would say. And so you can kind of look back and be okay, this is why this happened, and this is why this happened, and this is where this doctrine came from. This is where, so kind of it gives you more of an idea behind the people who were, they are leading the way, leading the charge for these different things that happen that affect your life today and how we view things and just the different way we interact in the modern church. It comes about from these people of the past, kind of forging the way for things we don't even understand and things like that, lost.
Yeah, and I really loved your laboratory model and thought about applied theology. I'm totally stealing that. I'll give you credit where is necessary, but I really love that model. And I also love what you said about genealogy and that we're, all a part of one family. And it makes me think of the passage 1 Corinthians 15 and the passages 1 Corinthians 15 and 2 Timothy 1, where basically we're told listen, this is what's been passed on to you. Your fathers and brothers in the faith and sisters and mothers in the faith have passed these things on to you. And now it's your duty to protect and preserve those things. And it is your duty to pass them on. You are now guard. You have been, appointed to stand guard of these truths and this history and all of these things. And now it's to stand guard and to pass it on, and so that makes me think of that too. It's this is your family duty. This is one of the things that you have to do. Yeah. And I liked what you said about, the applied theology and the laboratory. And it also kind of, serves as warnings, it lets you have these red flags that come up and you're hold on, we've been here before. This kind of thing has happened before. So yeah, that's fascinating. So why do you guys think that I'll include lots of people, even though I'm kind of a history junkie at times. Why have we not cared? And why has the evangelical church kind of not cared? And I'll say up until maybe about 10, 15 years ago, because I think there's definitely been a lot of things that have come out, and I don't want to cast aspersion on the current church. That's unfair. Cause right now there's a lot of what you guys are doing and valuing church history, but why for a while was it not something I wasn't raised. I didn't know who Augustine was. I didn't know who Spurgeon was. I wasn't raised with any of those voices. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's funny you say you didn't know, because when I came out of Bible college, I thought I'd gotten a pretty good education and I loved history and I took all the history classes. So I thought, oh, this will be a piece of cake. And when I started the show, I very quickly realized I don't know even 1% of the real heroes of our faith. There are so many amazing people that I could list off that I learned about from this show. And I was who was hiding all these guys? And then Elise does a lot of the guys from the early 1900s. And every time she brings a new person to me, I was he's so cool. How have I never heard about that guy before? I wish I knew the answer. When I first started doing this, I was on Twitter a little bit and I did the hashtag church history trivia. And I realized no one has ever even used that hashtag before.
My goodness.
But I was also that's kind of concerning. When I would look up the hashtag church history, I'd see lots of tweets by Catholics and Mormons, and kind of a little bit more, I don't want to be too neat, but they're a little more made up, if you know what I mean, a little bit more extra miracles and stuff happening kind of out there. And you just, maybe 5% of it was from evangelicals. And I was like, what is going on here that we don't really, and maybe we just don't like Twitter, but what is it that's keeping us from connecting really with this subject? I wish I could just pinpoint something. I'm not sure if it's a mixture of new is always better, or we need to focus on good theology. And as long as we correct the thinking, it's not as important where we came from. Or maybe we're scared of church history because there's like 1,000 years there where the Catholic Church is in charge of everything. And so we're like, well, I don't know if I want to touch that too much, because I know we put up an episode by Jean Gerson, and he's a very interesting preacher. And when we put it up, someone kind of messaged us and was like, hey, he's a Catholic, right? I'm like, yeah, he lived in the early 1400s. It'd be hard for him not to be, really, when you think about it. I mean, so I don't know what it is that makes us kind of afraid of that subject. And I think a lot of times we get confused and we go, well, I'm reading, and a lot of people who are into it now, though, I'm reading a book by John Owen, or I'm reading a book by John Calvin Institute. So now I'm getting my church history. I'm like, you're getting the theology from that era. But if you don't understand the context of John Calvin, he was a priest at like the age of 12 and 14. And then he came out of that Catholic Church around 19 and 20 after his dad died. And so when he talks about what's going on, he knows it from the inside. Like he was once on their side. You know what I'm saying? Like he's really explaining these subjects well from that perspective. If you don't understand all these little minutia details, it makes it much harder. It's much like scripture in the same way, where we realized through church history over time, we went, hey, wait a second, we need to understand the context. One of the big players of that was John Gill, who was like, we need to understand that the Bible was written by, Jewish people to Jewish people. We need to understand the Hebrew and stuff to get a better understanding of the New Testament. And in the same way, understanding some of this theology, it helps when you understand what they were talking about in their day. But I think a lot of times we pull it out from the 1500s, apply it today, and go, this is what I'm seeing. And it can do that, but it's not quite as good. And then the other side of it too, and like I said, it's the encouraging stories. The people and the lives that they lived are so encouraging. We were talking about how like this is the family of God, but I always think of it this way too, like God loved those people when they were alive. And since they're dead, it doesn't mean suddenly God lost them. We know that he still loves them. They're still cherished. They're still a part of that family. And we can just grow from that in a way. I think it's really encouraging. Most of the people hear our sermons and our podcasts, and when we first told people about them, we got this kind of vibe that like, that's going to be a really cool academic podcast that people in a very high up ivory tower sense are going to like. And there are lots of professors and people who do like our show, but most of the people that we reach with our show are moms that are homeschooling, high school students, young guys working at the warehouse and stuff like that. It reaches more laymen and regular people, I think, than anybody else, because there's just something really encouraging and rich and genuine in that old history.
Elise, why do you think that we haven't seen as much of this in the church, and like the evangelical church particularly? Because particularly the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox traditions would definitely they're all over their history. But why? What do you think about why maybe it's been lost a bit?
I kind of feel like maybe it's a little bit of, we think that we always have perfect theology wherever, like at the moment, we're always working towards that perfectionism. Like we don't want to look at this person because they were a little bit off in this area. And so we kind of discount the broader context of how of what they're doing. And so we always think like, okay, we want to make sure that we're right 100%, but like nobody's right 100% all the time. And so we end up discounting these people because in modern lenses, we go, well, that's kind of weird, even though it was more of a mainline thought, mainstream thought. And now we go, that's kind of weird. We're not going to touch it. And we can't get out of that mindset where it's just like, oh, we don't want to fall into hot heresy by accident by looking at this, thing, which when we look at it, when we look at all the things that they did, it's not that they were heretics. It's that they fall into things that they believe things that would not be things we believe today, but it doesn't make them, it doesn't completely eradicate their entire legacy, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I also think there's something, I guess I have two thoughts. First, I don't think that we just want to take the time. I think like it takes time. I mean, you guys have talked about like, it's a lot of work to dig it out and to figure out what it's saying in modern day language. And, and so I think there's a bit of, and we are definitely in a culture of ease, and the quickest is the best. And, like that mentality, obviously. And so, so I think that's one, and I also think I think you hit on something big, Troy, with the concern about Catholicism. I think there's this underlying tension amongst Protestants and, maybe even extra those of us who come out of, the 1920-ish fundamentalism branches, that it's too Catholic.
Yeah.
Well, they were, had all of those excesses and, that particular in the medieval era specifically, and so everything like what you were even saying, Elise, that they said is kind of disregarded. And the reality is, not only did God love them, God was working through them and he was speaking through them to his people and to his church, and so the likelihood that he will continue to speak to them, is pretty good, especially if if the things have survived. That's not a foolproof argument by any means, because some terrible stuff has survived too. but there really could truly be something there. I think the Protestant Reformation, I think the baby of church history sometimes got, I think to a degree it got thrown out with the bathwater. So what voices has stood out to you all as you've kind of dug into all of these different sermons and into church history itself? Who are the people that you have encountered that you have really like resonated with, and you just really are excited to offer what they have to say?
Probably number one would be Paris Reedhead. He's actually the first episode we ever did. And he does a sermon called 10 Shekels and a Shirt, which it actually, just in fairness, it starts a little bit slow because obviously they all read in KJV. And this is a very long passage that he goes through. But once you kind of get into the heart of what he's saying, he's talking about the dangers of humanism in the church and how that has influenced the way that people think. And it was preached, 50 plus years ago, but it's just as relevant then. And he kind of goes after, at that time, fundamentalism as well and things. So he goes to, literalism and fundamentalism and just the dangers of humanism. And you finish it and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this is all the things that
I've been so inculcated.
I need sackcloth and ashes. And then probably, let's see, James A. Stewart, which if you go and you look up James A. Stewart, you'll come up with James S. Stewart. I think they're both from Scotland. But I haven't done James S. Stewart. But it's very difficult because I was doing research on these two guys, and I was like, man, so this guy lived like two different lives, and I'm like, it's. But he is super, like, his sermon was really cool too. Just the way that they bring in like stories and illustrations, because they lived such interesting lives that like they'll just come in for things from personal experience that just like is really powerful. But just his story as being the first pastor to go behind the Iron Curtain after after everything was said and done after World War II. And he just has a really incredible story. And then you have J. Edwin Orr, who did everything under the sun. Like, this guy wrote like 60 plus books. He helped raise like war relief efforts during the Chinese Civil War, went over and like traveled all over China and things like that, which was not the safest thing to do. And then he ends up serving in World War II, going back to the places that he actually just was raising war relief efforts for, serves in some of the roughest parts of the war. So these guys just have incredible backstories, and those are probably my top three highlights so far. It's just really cool to see the history behind it and how that influences their preaching and things like that.
So I had this idea that all of them would be tough as nails guys like Martin Luther, who hammer the 95 Theses into the wall, and they say, like, I can stand, I can do no other. And I thought all the pastors of the past would be like that. And they would just be these tough guys that we would realize how small we are compared to them. And some of them are, you have John Knox and John Calvin and Martin Luther, and these guys are tough. And there is a reason we remember them in their era. But there are lots of guys who aren't like that at all. There are poets like Richard Sibbes, who are just these gentle-hearted guys who love people, love making music. There are people who are academic like B.B. Warfield, who just love working at Princeton Theological Seminary, and they had to be there for 10 years because his wife was sick, so he literally never left the campus. Very academic guys like that who write all these books. Then you have these other guys like Hudson Taylor and David Livingston. David Livingston going to places no one has literally ever been before. At least no European, has ever been before. And he's writing down these places and sending back, like, you won't believe the waterfall I just saw. And you have Hudson Taylor's just diving head first into the middle of China during the Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest civil wars of all time. And he's just encouraging his people that we're going to do a good thing for God. And I just realized, like, man, there's some of them are in government and politics. Some of them are involved in business. They're just very different people. There's no one fit person, one kind of person that God is going to use. It just really seemed to be a matter of, did they surrender whatever talents they had to God? Some people are like Charles Spurgeon, and they're preaching like 8 times a week. They're running a Bible college, they're running an orphanage, and they're just going and going and going. And at the same time, at the exact same place of the world, Alexander Mclaren, he just preaches once a week. He's very effective in his preaching, and God used that one talent he had to serve him. It doesn't have to look a certain way. As long as it's for God, God's going to see it and use it. And that really encouraged me and kind of empowered me to just not, like, I don't have to fit some kind of standard. I just need to do what I'm doing right now for God. The other thing too that really stood out to me about these guys, and the guys I kind of look up to, I mentioned some of them. There are people like Christmas Evans, who was illiterate until he was 17. He read the Bible, learned to read from the Bible, basically. And then he goes off and preaches some of the most literary, imaginative sermons about God I've ever seen. They're incredible. And then there are people like Hudson Taylor. We lived in China for a couple of years. We actually lived in Hangzhou, which was Hudson Taylor's capital. So probably just that feeling of like, I've been to the same place as you've been. He really stands out to me. And our listeners, if we have one group of people, one set of sermons that we always recommend, Dietrich Bonhoeffer sermons. The guy who does it, he really does a good job of just bringing to life the character of Bonhoeffer. And we always recommend, if you can catch those. We've had so many people say, I didn't understand what you were doing, and then I picked up that Bonhoeffer sermon, and now I totally get the need for this.
Yeah, when I listened to some sermons from getting ready for this podcast, I was struck by Watchman Nee's. There's a sermon called "Why the Waste?" or "Why This Waste?" or something like that, and was just like, I've heard of him, and I could have told you who he was, but I wouldn't have been able to, I've never engaged any of his books or any of his, writings or anything like that, and I was just floored by just how beautiful it was and the depth of reflection and just like really great stuff. And so I was really interested that you guys had included him. And like, are you making an effort to have more diverse voices than just, like Anglo-Saxons, or, what's your approach with that?
It's very difficult. We try to include as many people my goal would be to have everybody from every continent and everybody from every
well, of course.
So that's evangelical, that we can rely on their doctrine. The hardest part, though, is before the 1900s, even people that you would think, like William Carey or Adoniram Judson, these very famous names that you're like, yeah, I've heard of them. You would think it would be easy to find a sermon by them. And it's not, because just not a lot of people wrote down everything they did. There are lots of really famous preachers and people like that who if no one wrote it down, you don't have it. And that also is the same problem with finding people from other countries and from other backgrounds or from more oppressed classes, or, I would love to have more, preachers who were preaching to the churches of slavery and stuff in the 1800s in America. I think they have probably some really interesting things to say. But if nobody wrote it down, you're limited by what you do have. And that's the same thing with, there's a lot. I always am looking for different missionaries and people who were maybe like in the Church of Korea in the early 1800s or late 1800s, and these different places where I'm like, man, it'd be so cool if we could hear their stories and their sermons, but we just can't because nobody wrote them down. So we do the best we can with our show. We really try to reach out, and we'll have people on, like we had John Sung and Watchman Nee, and we've had a few different African-American preachers from those eras too. But we've had people say like, man, it seems like a lot of people are coming from the same place. I'm like, I'd love to expand out and do different things. We pick people that are already kind of off the beaten path. We've done sermons by Jonathan Swift, Soren Kierkegaard, a guy named Wyatt Sterling who lived at the bottom of the earth, down at the tip of South America, and he was literally living on an island by himself for a year, and no one even knew if he was alive. Like, we do try to reach these guys who are just kind of off the beaten path a little bit, but you can only go so far before you're like, and there's no content here. I can't make a sermon there. So if anybody is listening
and they come across and they know of those sermons, then feel free to forward them on to Revive Studios, because you guys would be very interested in featuring them.
And I mean, even some famous people like John Huss, you would think that's a name, if you don't know him very well. He got burned 100 years before the Reformation, but he promised that a Reformation would come. This guy, you would think, okay, he's a very famous preacher. His sermons do exist, but they're locked up in like ancient Czech in a library in Europe. So, I mean, what do you would think even someone like that who's very famous, we don't have him. There's this group of people in Ethiopia in the 1300s who kind of have their own version of a Reformation in Africa. And it's, we have no sermons by them. We can't really do a whole lot. We don't know. So it makes it really hard to figure out exactly what was going on. So it is one of the fallbacks of church history, is you don't always get the story. But the kind of flip side of that too is you don't have to worry about these guys going down in scandals, because their scandals are already known. So it's not
That's true.
too much betraying me at this point.
So just one final question. And you already mentioned Bonhoeffer, but if someone listening only had the time, so we talked about time earlier being kind of an issue for people. So if they only really had the time to listen to like 2 of the sermons that you all have featured, which ones would you suggest? I already said Watchman Nee, Why the Waste. So, but what about you all?
Well, the guys that I just mentioned, actually, I like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is great. He's done the most recent ones that we've done. And that's pretty cool. But if I had to choose like 2 that I'd be like, okay, these are the guys you have to listen to. Paris Reedhead and his thing on humanism, incredible, life-changing. People have listened to, apparently there's people that go, I listen to a sermon whenever I'm feeling like I need it, like once a year. It's like this purge. And it's I'm like, I could feel that though. I feel like that's gonna be one I go back to as well. And then James A. Stewart again. I thought he draws you. It's like he's got so many stories that he tells, but they're so relatable. Because sometimes you hear stories and you're like, I have no idea what you're trying to say with this story. All of his stories, you're like, oh my gosh, like I understand this. I get it. It relates. And you're like, they're so impactful. And those are the 2 I would say hands down. Check out.
Okay. What about you, Troy?
That is tough. I mean, that's like, you got to take out, you have 90 kids, but you only get to pick 2. No, I don't know. We've done 90 different sermons and episodes and some really great preachers. I don't think you can go wrong with, I did say Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as I highly encourage that one. I think he really, the gentleman who does it brings them to life very well. And we rarely have anybody go, I didn't like that one. We have a Charles Spurgeon that will be out next week. I think is going to be very good. Any of the Charles Spurgeons, and they're kind of classics, but he is the Prince of Preachers for a reason. So I do think those are going to be very good ones that you can do too. And if I can throw a third one out there, it's not David Livingston. Also, we did one on him over the summer. Highly recommend it. It's a very interesting episode. He kind of tells his journey through Africa and the people he met, and what it was like to preach the gospel to him. And I think it just is really eye-opening and kind of challenges a lot of what we think we know about these people and they're kind of the way they live their life. And you go, wow, okay, I kind of got that. That would be really hard to go through.
Oh, fascinating. Okay, well, so if you're listening, there you go. You have a playlist of about 6 or 7 different sermons that 3 of your brothers and sisters in Christ say are excellent and you should listen to. Okay. So I just want to thank you guys so much for joining us and taking time to tell us about your ministry and for the chat about church history and why it should matter and why maybe it hasn't for the evangelical church recently or somewhat recently. And just really want to thank you for your time. Thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. We enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us on. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you for those of you who are listening, for joining us. And please be sure to join us next week when we discuss issues of God and culture. And if you enjoyed this podcast and other podcasts, please be sure to subscribe on whichever platform you use. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Table Podcast. For more podcasts like this one, visit dts.edu/the table. Dallas Theological Seminary. Teach truth, love well.